Good evening. I wasn't expecting anyone to drop by today, but since you're here, I guess you're looking for something. A story, perhaps? Maybe a story concerning a certain silver-haired fox? Perhaps also involving a raven-haired scorpion? Well, you've come to the right place. So, why don't you sit back, relax, and grab yourself a goblet of wine, and I shall tell you the story of Times Have Changed. Chapter 1, The Escape. It was a cold, damp place, with endless coursing of bluish-grey, wet stone bricks stacked from floor to ceiling. Mushrooms and moss grew from the aged, decrepit stonework. It was the only signs of life in that dank, dark place. The place was silent, only the occasional dripping of water echoed down its halls. However, the silence of this place was disturbed by purposeful marching, the sound of something heavy being dragged, as rushed footsteps splashed into small puddles of water that the damp from the walls had created. Suddenly, a warm orange glow illuminated the slimy-looking walls. The light source shone from a man's hand, as he held the torch boldly in front of himself. As he passed torches hung from the wall beside him, he lit them one by one. The man looked out of place in this dark, dank dungeon. He wore fine clothes of blue silk, embroidered with gold lace. His long features made him look effeminate, and he walked tall, elegantly, extended his limbs as if each movement was purposeful and well rehearsed. His dark brown hair, long and straight, flowed behind him, catching the wind as he walked at a fast pace to his destination. Although he appeared to walk fast, his walk was unhurried. However, heavy footsteps echoing down the narrow halls were not from his steps. Soon behind him followed two men, broad, muscle-bound, brutish-looking men in cheap and broken leather patchwork armour. It was mercenary armour. Their faces were deeply cast in shadow, hidden beneath their hoods. Between them they held a young woman, still just a teenager. They pulled this young woman by her thin yet muscular arms, as her feet dragged behind on the floor, leaving a small trail of blood as her skin was torn against the rough stones. She wore only a thin nightdress, and it was heavily torn, displaying evidence of a struggle, of a fight. Her head hung heavy, with her chin resting on her chest, bobbing from side to side with the mercenary's movement. Her face was covered by her long raven hair that fell almost to her thighs, but it was knotted and matted, giving her a crazed, wild look. The effeminate-looking man that walked before them stopped at an ancient, heavy wooden cell door. He opened it, the lock making a loud clang as he pushed the door open. The cell was even dirtier, damper, and foul-smelling to the rest of the dungeon. The dried blood on the walls indicated the room's use. He stood by the door and nodded to the men. They seemed to understand his gesture as they walked into the room and dropped the woman with a thud on the floor. She let out a yelp as she landed with her total weight on her knees on the cold stone floor. The two men took a step back as the effeminate man closed the door and walked in front of the tortured young woman. The silence seemed to have made the woman curious. Laboured, she slowly looked up at the man walking towards her. She shook from the pain and from the cold as her hot breath pushed past her lips like a small cloud. Her hair stuck to her from the grazes covering her face. Her face covered with such dark matted hair, only her piercing grey eyes peeped from the darkness. The man knelt to her, shaking his head as if in disappointment. "Gwendolyn, why have you forced my hand? I told you, you will never escape from here. You will never escape me. You thought you were clever, didn't you? You may have predicted my actions using Connor to aid your escape, but I will always be one step ahead of you. Although you didn't help yourself keeping that journal of yours," he tutted as he shook his head at her. She gritted her teeth, narrowing her eyes at him, but she stayed still. She did not move to attack him, although she showed signs of violence. He smiled, watching her, watching how she struggled. "You understand, I must punish you now." He stood up, turning his back to her. He paced the room slowly, holding his chin in thought. "But how, do you ask? That is an excellent question, Gwen," he responded for her. "I have taken everything you love, everything you cherish, your clothes, your makeup, your jewellery, even your room. It is becoming increasingly difficult to punish you." She gave a small and breathy, pained laugh. "Maybe you should just let me go. I'm obviously not learning my lesson." The effeminate man turned to her and smiled sadistically. "Nice try, Gwen. But no, I must be firm. I've been too soft on you in the past." Yeah, the torture, the starvation beforehand were far too soft of a punishment. What could you possibly have planned for me that is any worse than what you've already done to me? Again, he knelt before her, closer than before, with the same sadistic smile. Gwendolyn tensed her arms, gritting her teeth as she smelt his sweetly perfumed breath. It made her uncomfortable how close he knelt to her. "Have you seen any of the torture equipment from your homeland? It's decorated in such a beautiful fashion." Slowly he pulled from behind his back, by magic, a whip, but no ordinary whip. This indeed was finely decorated in silver with a dragon-carved handle, 9 ropes knotted down its length, and at the end sat an intricately cut golden carved eagle head with very sharp-looking beaks. The woman's eyes widened in fear as she analysed every inch of the torture device. She began to shake. She knew exactly what was coming. Her eyes quickly looked up at his pleadingly. "Searle, please, you don't have to do this. You've scared me. I promise I won't escape again. I've learnt my lesson." He smiled, shaking his head at her. "It's but words, and I'm afraid words from your vile, fictitious little mouth mean nothing. You will not disobey me again after this. I'm sure of it." Tears began to fill her eyes. Her lips quivered as fear had her struck to the core. "Please, Searle, please, I beg you. But please, not that. You will disfigure me." He held her chin softly, looking down his nose at her. "I know you pride your beauty over all else, and this is the last thing I can take from you." He moved away from her, her eyes wide and manic as she breathed heavier. "Searle, Searle, please, God, no, please don't do this." She tried to reach out for him, to plead with him, but her arms were pulled and upstretched either side of her by an unseen force. It was his magic that moved her. She continued to look at him with tears in her eyes, but pleading and crying did not help. She was not going to be saved. The mage handed the cat-o'-nine tails to the mercenaries. Gwendolyn's eyes were wide as she watched whoever held the instrument of torture. "Please don't do this," she whispered desperately, but neither of the men listened to our anguished cries. Both mercenaries stood behind her, and her tearful gaze was fixed on the mage. She shook her head at him, pleading, but he only smiled at her. It made her sick how much he enjoyed her pain. She felt her hair being pushed from her back, surrounding her face, but then 2 hands gripped at her dress and in one swift movement tore the clothing and revealed her back. Gwendolyn shot Searle a curious smile, still teary-eyed, but he was most stunned by her slight smile. "You don't have to do this," she said in a threatening manner. He didn't understand how or why she had changed so quickly from despairing to intimidating. He knew it must be a trap to stop him from punishing her. He was used to her games, and he saw so many of her games in the past. He gave her a stern, cold look, then still not moving his eyes from hers, he nodded to the mercenary that held the whip. "Proceed," he said coldly. Gwendolyn waited for the pain. She tensed, but it was unlike any pain she was to experience before. The first strike to her back, she opened her mouth wide, but the pain was so intense she could not scream. She could not move. All she could do was stare at Searle's dark eyes. The eagle heads had latched into her. She felt as the man tugged, but they were hooked into her skin. He gave another tug, and she felt her skin stretch. She gritted her teeth with a growl. Suddenly, on the third tug, she felt the hooks rip through her skin. She let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the passages of the old abandoned dungeon. Her head fell to her chest and she panted. "How many whips?" she heard the mercenary ask. She smiled to herself, even as she shook from her pain. She knew then the sight of her back must have been horrific. She heard it in his voice. He wanted to stop. Again, slowly she looked up to Searle, with a small, curious smile. It angered him to see her smile, and she knew it. 6 more times, he said, looking behind her to the mercenary that held the whip. Then slowly and menacingly he moved his eyes to Gwendolyn. 1 for each year we have spent together. "You're such a romantic, Searle," Gwendolyn whispered with an exhausted laugh. His face twisted in anger. He looked to the mercenary and nodded to him to continue. Quickly she gritted her teeth as the lashings fell upon her skin in quick succession. Again her eyes widened and her lips fell open to a panicked breath. It wasn't just the pain that affected her, almost rendering her unconscious. It was the sound of the wet rope slapping against her skin, as she knew it was wet from her blood. As she felt her skin splitting and tearing, then slowly the feeling of the hot, sticky blood running down her back, her bottom, and over her feet. The blood slowly pooled, surrounding her in a crimson puddle. She felt as though she was about to pass out. The pain was becoming unbearable, as she could feel flaps of her skin rolling away from her back, as her back burnt with pain. She shook uncontrollably, trying desperately to stay awake. However, a sound distracted her, the sound of heavy breathing. She could barely believe how unfit the mercenary was. She looked up to Searle as he heard the mercenary behind her panting out of breath. "You need to hire fitter mercenaries next time," she whispered in a shaken voice in agony. The mercenary cursed her. "And she's still conscious," one of the men exclaimed. Behind her. I told you, she's no normal girl. Again, strike her, Searle ordered. The man whispered as he hit her. Gwendolyn gritted her teeth, staring at Searle. Again, he cried in another lashing, but still she stared at him. Again, again, again! 3 more lashings, and the man panted if he was about to keel over. Gwendolyn's head fell to her chest, and she heard Searle's quickened breath in his rage. She cried, shaking at her pain, at her torture. He smiled slowly as Gwendolyn's cry turned into a laugh. His smile quickly faded. He looked at her with anger and snarling at her laugh. What's so funny, Gwen? She shook her head, laughing harder. Slowly, she looked up into his eyes. Thought you said you were always 1 step ahead of me. Her words were slow, her voice shook from her pain. Searle looked down at her, confused, and he didn't understand how she was still conscious, let alone able to talk. He saw from the blood surrounding her that she must be in immense pain. He slowly saw how her eyes began to glow a bright blue, inhuman blue. He watched as she smiled, licking the blood from her lips. He felt as her power grew, but he didn't understand. She wore the choker engraved with magical binding spells. It was specifically made for Gwendolyn to bind her of all of her magical gifts, the supernatural gifts he gave her. He smiled and watched on. He didn't smile, but he watched on, horrified, as she slowly sat up with a straight back. With a flick of her wrist, she broke the spell that held her arms outstretched. She rolled her shoulders, relieving the pressure, and continued to stare at Searle's dumbfounded face. How are you doing this? He whispered, flabbergasted. She took hold of her choker and threw it to the floor. Searle slowly stepped back away from her, readying himself for a fight. He knew what she was capable of, hence why he had forced her to wear the choker. He didn't check to see if it was secured. Gwendolyn rubbed her neck. The skin blistered and raw from where it sat on her neck for so many years. He looked at her, panic-stricken. He felt her energy increase like electric static in the air. He knew what was coming. He knew then precisely why she had endured the lashings. Even as she had access to her powers, he knew why she smiled, even in the agonizing pain. Must have been the only sense she felt. Gwendolyn raised her arms, her palms facing the ceiling. As her arms raised, so did the blood from the floor, levitating, defying gravity. Searle surrounded himself in a circular misty force, preventing any magic from anyone else to penetrate it and cause him harm. He watched her, wary, feeling as she called upon the dark. They heard them before they saw them, their hot, laboured breath, the creaking of their movements, their long, sharp claws dragging across the stone floor. Both mercenaries screamed and shouted as they saw the red, glowing eyes from the shadows. What is that? One shouted. Searle watched on, amazed at her strength, how she conjured so quickly. He remembered when it would give her a nosebleed just to call upon one demon, but now he saw 20 stood behind her, crawling and licking their lipless mouths as they stared at the 2 mercenaries. Eerily slow, they moved from the shadows, creeping towards the 2 men. Both men stood too terrified to run, the demon's long and skinny limbs moving every inch closer to them. Meanwhile, Gwendolyn's gaze did not once move from Searle as she stared at him with insidious intent. "Kill them," Gwendolyn said softly. "Yes, mistress," demons answered all at one in one voice. Their eyes widened in excitement. Both men screamed, running past her, but she saw from the corners of her eyes as they stopped in mid-flight. Two demons slid from each of the men's shadows and towered over them, opening their mouths impossibly wide, both at the same time, bit down both the mercenaries' necks, swallowing their entire heads in one bite. Both bodies fell to the floor, spraying blood from their headless neck. Searle watched on, horrified at his creation. He had seen her do many terrible things, but he had never been so close to the violence before, to smell the blood, to feel the fear. Gwendolyn's demons turned their sights to Searle. "No," she said firmly. "You won't kill him." Gwendolyn held her hand out as the blood floated in a long string to her hand and coiled around her forearm. She used the blood magic like whips, hitting it as magical shield. The spell was holding, but it was weakening. He was frightened. She was stronger than him, and for the first time since giving her this gift. He threw a magical force at her, but to his horror a nearby demon jumped in front of her and ate the spell, just opening its mouth and suddenly rendering the magic powerless. He watched it, completely perplexed. He had no idea that was even possible. To his surprise, he didn't realize Gwendolyn surrounded his protective sphere in blood, creeping from the floor. He watched on helpless as the blood crawled up the sphere, wrapping him in a complete darkness. Searle then heard the breathing of the demons inside the sphere. Searle dropped his spell in a panic and saw Gwendolyn standing face to face with him, her blood in the shape of a dagger in her hand. Searle looked at her wide-eyed. She grabbed his robe and pushed him up against the wall, holding the dagger to his throat. He couldn't move. He couldn't believe her strength. It was as if a block of iron had him pressed against the wall. He was regretting giving her that mutation. He truly didn't understand how intimidating she was until he stood on the wrong side of her. As Searle was no longer controlling her, as he stood a mere hair's width from death. "You have no idea how much I want to kill you," she whispered, her voice shaking in pain. "You have no idea how long I have been waiting for this." She threw the dagger to the floor and grabbed his throat, pulling her face to his. "All the times you sent me to hell, all the times you tortured me, starved me, mutated me, cut me open for all your experiments, every time I was thinking how I was going to murder you." She tightened her grip on his throat, then slowly stepped back, letting him go in a final act of mercy. "Remember this, Searle. Remember that time that I spared your life. In return, I ask you leave me be." Searle held his throat, looking at her fiercely from his dark eyes and his curled lips. "You will regret this, girl." Gwendolyn looked at him with saddened eyes. He saw her conflict, and it surprised him. "Goodbye, Searle." She saw the spell he was about to conjure, but Gwendolyn quickly made her hand into a fist and punched him across the face. He collapsed to the ground, falling instantly unconscious. The demons laughed, looking at him. "We eat him now, mistress. Your paths will cross again." Gwendolyn closed her eyes and looked away. No, we must leave. We must leave now." Gwendolyn took one last look at the man, the mage that had given her everything and taken so much also. She tightened her jaw and threw open the door running down the cold, dark corridors. She knew where she was going. She knew what she wanted, as Searle wasn't wholly right. There was one thing he did not take from her. She ran so fast she skidded as Gwendolyn stopped at a cell door. She looked into it and instantly smiled. Shadow, come on, we're leaving. As she opened the cell door, a Frisian horse with raven-coloured hair, just the same as hers, greeted her as if joyful, throwing its head to and fro. The horse was so large it barely fit in the cell, towering over her. The horse nuzzled Gwendolyn's face with affection. She smiled as she patted the mare's jaw. Good girl, follow me. Gwendolyn quickly picked up a small wooden box before moving out of the cell with the horse. The demons moved through the shadows, and obediently Shadow followed Gwendolyn into a vast laboratory room at the end of the seemingly endless corridors. Panicked, Gwendolyn had quite not thought her plan through. She knew she would incapacitate Searle. Gwendolyn knew that she would make his way to his laboratory and escape through a portal. She had seen Searle open many portals in the 7 years, but she had never herself done it. She looked about the lab, her breathing laboured, her head span. She was losing blood, and she was losing it fast. Gwendolyn held onto her horse, feeling her strength fade. Her demons moved closer to her. Even in their fearsome state, they showed concern for her, for their mistress. We can show you the portal, mistress. You must hurry. You must not die. Gwendolyn's eyes heavy, and their voices seemed to become more and more distant. Come, show me, she breathed, her eyes barely open. Open the portal to the outside, anywhere, I don't care, as long as it's far away from here. They all gathered around her, and her 2 tallest demons stood either side of her. Hold on to us, Gwendolyn. The animal was scared. We will support you. Sluggishly, she moved her arm around her demon's pointed and bony shoulders. She was not surprised how its skin felt almost too hot, thick, leathery skin, almost nothing but bone. She let her other hand slide from Shadow, and heavily she threw her arm over the shoulder of the demon to her left. They both looked at her and smiled their lipless smiles. Are you ready? They all asked as one. Gwendolyn found it hard to talk. Her breath became so laboured that she could not summon enough air to make a sound. She nodded instead. You must concentrate, mistress. Use your energy. Repeat the words after us. Gwendolyn closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Slowly as she opened her eyes, they blazed a brilliant, bright and human blue. The demons looked at her and continued to smile. They began to speak a language she did not understand, but she felt herself flow into a trance as she repeated their words. She felt the energy building, growing and hovering in front of her until she heard that all so familiar sound, the low hum, the deep rumble, the whirling of air. She smiled as she saw the colours of orange and black sparkle, like the beginnings of a fire, until the air electrified, and a small implosion, a circular portal opened up in front of them. Gwendolyn heard Shadow snort at the energy in her room, and reared away from the portal. Gwendolyn gave a small triumphant laugh, looking into the portal. She looked to her demon, suddenly feel a surge of energy. Gwendolyn! She heard Searle scream down the hall. Ride! Gwendolyn shouted. With a surge of adrenaline, she ran to Shadow, and with all of her might she jumped and mounted the 15-hand high horse with an exacerbated grunt. She looked down to her demons. Please stay here. Keep Searle distracted until the portal is closed, and then return to your realm. They bowed to her. As you wish, mistress. Gwendolyn, Searle roared, his voice closer this time. Gwendolyn held onto Shadow's neck and pushed her heels into the mare's side. Now, Shadow, ride! The horse did as she commanded and ran straight into the portal. Gwendolyn's heart raced. In a blink of an eye they were thrown out of the portal. She had no idea where they were, but she did not look back. It was a moonless night, but Gwendolyn did not care. It was the first time she had seen the outside world without Searle there to control her in 7 years. She smelt the clean, fresh air of the forest. Even as she felt faint from blood loss, and Gwendolyn was barely conscious, still she smiled. She smiled because for the first time in her life she was free. But now was no time to rest. Gwendolyn needed help, and she needed healing fast. The once quiet forest rattled with unrest as she raced through the undergrowth on her raging mare. The mare looked out like a fiend as she snarled and foamed at the mouth, spooked by the events that led to the place. With no saddle, Gwendolyn savagely clung to the mare's mane, still clutching her wooden box. It was a cold winter's night, and their breath could be seen in the freezing night air. Just beyond the trees she saw hope. She saw lights acting as a beacon from the torment she was attempting to escape. She dug her bare heels into the mare, trying desperately to run faster towards the lights, but the mare needed no encouragement. As they broke through the tree line, Gwendolyn saw a small village. Lights were shining and the candles were burning. She so hopeful there would be someone, just anyone, to help her. Breathing heavily, almost wheezing, she attempted to look back. She saw nothing. She prayed Searle had not followed her from the portal, that it had closed in time. Her heart beat rhythmically in her chest with the same thudding beat as that of the horse's hooves on the woodland undergrowth. She tried to scream her horse's name in an attempt to relieve herself of some adrenaline, in some vain attempt to get her mare to ride faster, to get closer to help, closer to safety, but she couldn't make any noise. She was cold, exhausted, and hurt. All she could manage was a throaty moan. All she could focus on was the wet cobbled path leading the way to an unprepared peasant village. The village was getting closer, so close now she could make out the thatched roofs detailing of the housing in the dark. A street lamp fired by the entrance of the village, flickering in the winter's wind. The wooden sign embossed with the village's name, Blostamarket, swung back and forth on its hinges, squeaking as it did so, but Gwendolyn had no concern for the name of the village. All she needed was help. The mare finally reached the mortared road. It was almost as exhausted as its rider, as it stumbled with the change in terrain. Gwendolyn clamped down with her bare hands on the poor mare's mane. She tried so hard to maintain her balance on the horse's back, with all her muscles bulging with every inch of her arms. She winced as she felt the skin around her wounds stretch and bleed more as she tensed her back. But it was all in vain. Upon entering the village, Shadow's hoof landed on a patch of ice, making the horse's front legs collapse beneath her. As the horse's head fell forward, so did the entirety of Gwendolyn. Her back slammed flat, bare and bloody straight on the iced floor. The pain was almost unbearable. With the wind knocked from her lungs, Gwendolyn felt her vision begin to fade, but still she clung hold of her wooden box. Maybe someone will find me here, she thought to herself. Maybe someone will pull me into the warm and help me. She sorely let her head fall to one side, and she watched as the blood flowed away from her, steaming in the cold air as the fluid coursed into the crevices of the mortared street. She was losing blood fast. She didn't have much longer to live. It was all for nothing if she didn't move now. Searle would have won, although she was sure he would not have seen it that way. After all, she was but an object, and influential men did not like to lose expensive rare treasures. Making herself angry, she dug deep and lethargically. She rolled to one side, grunting and groaning. She pulled her hands up to either side of her chest. She panted as she used every last ounce of strength to lift herself to her feet. She exhaled violently, pushing herself up. Then unexpectedly she felt a tug at her dress. She looked up, seeing her horse, her mare, with her dress in her mouth, as if Shadow was trying to lift her rider even. Gwendolyn had no strength to smile, but her eyes glassed over with grateful tears. As she slowly made her way to her feet, she patted the mare's jaw. "Thank you, Shadow." Gwendolyn's voice sounded in the winter's night, laboured and almost silent. Limping with a slight hunchback, Gwendolyn lurched to every nearby house, bashing on every front door she could find. "Help me, please!" she screamed at the top of her voice. "Please, someone help me!" As she moved from the village's high street, slowly one by one, the lights of the houses were snuffed out, as if no one was home and as if she wouldn't notice. With each unanswered door and each snuffed candle, her hope diminished. There must be a tavern or an inn, she thought, someone to take me in. Shadow followed closely behind, feeling her panic. Then, like a light in the dark, Gwendolyn heard the squeaking of hinges. As she looked up, she saw a sign, a hound and hare, and the lights had not been snuffed out. She limped as fast as she could towards the sign. She brought herself up the 3 steps of the stairs, holding almost her weight on the handlebars. Panting, she tried to scream for help, but she soon noticed how heavy her hair felt. With her hands slipping on the handlebars, she looked down to see her arms and hands were completely covered in blood. Her head started to spin, and she fell into the front door of the inn. Her vision fuzzy, and all she heard were the noises, voices as if she was submerged under water. She did not see shapes, but different blobs of light. She felt herself being moved, but her body was fighting to stay awake. The landlord of the inn came rushing behind the bar of the closed tavern, silent and empty. The sound of the body falling down panicked everyone that was residing in the establishment. The landlord was a tall, skinny man with a kind face. His clothes and appearance showed he worked hard and had little time for cosmetics. He rushed to the body lying on the tavern floor. He gasped as he saw the woman's back torn to ribbons. Her back just looked like a mass of raw meat. He quickly took hold of his waistcoat and laid it next to her. He rolled her over with the hope that the waistcoat would absorb some of the blood, or at very least slow her bleeding. He pulled at the mass of matted, bloody hair from her face. He gasped at her youth, was surprised by her beauty. How could anyone do this to such a girl? He whispered to himself. He soon heard the soft footsteps behind him. A petite young girl, the age of 8, stood cold and unconfidently with her knees knocking together. She curled a strand of long blonde hair nervously around her finger. "Father," she asked softly. He turned to her in a hurry, but his voice remained calm. "Lottie, this lady is hurt. She needs our help. Can you bring me towels and boil some water, and bring me everything we own in the medicine box?" "But father, who is she?" the girl asked, shaking. I don't know, Lottie, but please hurry, she's badly hurt. As his voice slightly raised, the girl ran off and did as her father asked. The landlord focused all of his attentions back on the mysterious woman, with no idea of who she was, where she had come from, but he had an overwhelming urge to look after her and to keep her safe. He held her face softly. He was concerned by how cold her skin felt. He was surprised she wasn't already dead. Can you hear me? He asked. We're going to help you. Gwendolyn slowly opened her bloodshot eyes. She was not wholly lucid, still clutching her small wooden box, but she felt safe for the first time in her life. Gwendolyn felt as though she would be looked after. She felt a kindness she had never felt before. She smiled gradually as she looked up at the innkeep's kind brown eyes. Thank you, she whispered before closing her eyes and allowing herself, her body, to pass out from the trauma, the pain, and the blood loss.